Commonwealth Bank says its margins are being squeezed, but overall the banking sector has had a record year. Consumer sentiment tumbles after last week's rate hike, and the government's set to outlaw vaping. Welcome to Fear and Greed Business News, Australia's best business podcast. It is Wednesday, the 15th of November, 2023. I'm Michael Thompson, and good morning, Sean Aylmer.
Good morning, Michael. Couple of days back in the office. You feel like that holiday in Fiji was a long, long time ago?
It feels like it was last year, Sean.
Yep.
Having said that, though, Sean, we have a really good interview coming up today, which makes up for it entirely. It is a chat with Darren Hopkins and Blair Sutton from McGrath-Nicol Advisory, who is a fantastic supporter of the podcast. But this is a very topical, very timely conversation.
Yes, it's their third annual survey on cybercrime. What I find amazing is the information that they talk about in terms of how many people face ransomware attacks, how many people pay the ransom, and how much they pay on average each time. Fascinating stats and fascinating chat with Darren and Blair. Certainly better than going on holidays in Fiji.
I think you might be right there. And I particularly love the fact that they actually do kind of tell you some of the figures and things. It is a really interesting insight into a position that no business ever wants to be in, but
many are.
Yeah, indeed. Now, the main story this morning, Sean, Commonwealth Bank released its quarterly earnings yesterday, making a $2.5 billion cash profit, but its profit margins are being squeezed.
Profit margins are being squeezed. Quite the euphemism, Michael. The pressure isn't only on in home loans, but also in deposit markets. Banks take money on deposit and use it to lend on to home borrowers and other loans like cars and things like that. The net interest margin, broadly, is the gap between the two. And the Commonwealth Bank said competition is emerging in the deposit side of the equation. The pace of growth of new home loans and deposits at the Commonwealth Bank is now below the average for the sector. Now, Boss Matt Common doesn't seem too worried about that, though he did say the bank's upped its provision for bad debts and higher interest rates are biting. Like ANZ on Monday, Commonwealth Bank is pointing out that higher interest rates is actually good for people putting their money into the bank, and investors are taking advantage of that.
Now, Sean, with all big banks now having reported their last fiscal year results, earnings across the four banks hit a record $32 billion. Now, that's up 8% from a year earlier.
Yes, that was driven by loan growth and profit margin expansion, particularly in the first half of the year. The rising interest rate environment has definitely been a plus for the banks. So too the easing, but not cessation, of competition in the housing market. Now, most of the benefits flowed through in the first half. Operating expenses were also higher. The good news is that credit quality across the sector is generally pretty sound. There's been no mortgage cliff as people have shifted from fixed rate loans to variable loans at a much higher rate. What's interesting is that the banks are looking well beyond the mortgage market to demonstrate their wares. They're looking for different growth prospects, small business lending, institutional lending, business deposits, that type of thing. I mean, they always do, but this time around, it's been highlighted a bit more. The banks are looking for new ways to make money.
All right. How did local markets perform yesterday?
The S&P ASX 200 closed up 0.8% to finish at just over 7,000 points, with energy and materials companies doing best on the back of high commodity prices. Tech stocks, real estate investment trusts and industrials also did well. Woodside Energy, Santos and Fortescue Metals Group all closed up at about 3% or somewhere between 2.5% and 3%. Rio Tinto was up a couple of percent. BHP jumped 1%. Westpac was the best of the banks, rising 1.3%. National Australia Bank went ex-dividend. That fell 3% as a result. Suncorp had a strong day, as did WiseTech Global. Bit of corporate news around. Jeweller Michael Hill held its AGM. It said sales are up by just 2% in the first 19 weeks of the financial year, and margins are under pressure. More promotions and higher diamond and gold prices have led to margins being squeezed. There's that word again, Michael. And laboratory services giant ALS, well, its share price jumped 9% after releasing its half-year results. It was the best on the day. Worst was Link Administration, down 3.3%.
Diamond prices is really not something that we talk about much on Fear and Greed, is it?
Tomorrow, let's do a diamond price story because they're really interesting what's going on, because they absolutely boomed during the pandemic. I mean, De Beers is the biggest diamond supplier, did really well during the pandemic, but prices have really come off again. In fact, let's do a story tomorrow on diamond prices.
I would love that.
Good.
Thank you. Thank you for doing that. It feels like you're doing it just for me. International markets, Sean, what's going on?
Lots going on in diamond prices. Let's talk about that tomorrow, Michael. Oil prices edged up slightly, helped by confidence about global demand, even though the global economy is slowing. OPEC said global supply balances were tight, and that pushed prices higher. Iron ore prices continued their solid run, with futures rising yesterday. Aussie dollars buying just under 64 US cents, while Bitcoin's worth about 36,500 US dollars a unit.
Sean, I know what you've been trying to do to me so far in this episode. Twice now you have referred to, like in the beginning of the show, the very first story, you referred to the euphemism of profit margins being squeezed. And then you dropped another subtle hint in there about things being squeezed. I know that you're trying to just kind of derail me. You're trying to just go, Michael's immature. I'm going to get him to laugh. And you know what? I'm trying to prove to you that out of the two of us, I am the mature one.
What? I did say euphemism. What were you thinking when I said euphemism?
We'll be back in a moment with the rest of the day's business news. Sean, consumer sentiment has tumbled on the back of last week's interest rate hike and is in deeply pessimistic territory.
The Westpac Melbourne Institute Consumer Sentiment Survey fell this month, with the high cost of living and prospect of further rate rises culling confidence. Westpac used the phrase deeply pessimistic, which doesn't sound too good, really. Most consumers expect interest rates to rise further and are set for a repeat of last year's penny-pinching Christmas. Weak sentiment weighs on spending, of course, and the survey's measures of long-term spending were also a little lower. On the flip side, businesses are far less pessimistic. National Australia Bank Monthly Business Survey for October says business conditions are up a bit, above the long-run average. Trading conditions and profitability were both higher. Business confidence is down a bit. That's not real good, but it's not a disaster like consumer sentiment.
Sean, bit of drama in politics yesterday. Veteran Liberal MP Russell Broadbent has quit the party, reducing the number of coalition MPs in the House of Reps to just 55.
Yes, and of course, earlier in the year, Nationals MP Andrew Gee quit the party. That was in opposition to the Indigenous Voice to Parliament decision by the coalition. Liberal MP Julian Leeser also quit the front bench over the same reason, though she didn't actually quit the party. Broadbent lost pre-selection in his Melbourne seat of Monash over the weekend. In fact, he was soundly defeated. His 72-year-old has been elected a number of times and then lost his seat a number of times as well. With him going to the crossbench, that takes 18 who are sitting on those benches. It doesn't make that much difference to legislation in the House of Reps because Labor has enough seats in that House. After the announcement, Prime Minister Anthony Albanese told his MPs that opposition leader Peter Dutton was failing to hold his party together. He was speaking to the Labor caucus. Now, in the caucus, Albanese said Muslims, Jews and Palestinians were really hurting at the moment. He set out the need for Labor to unequivocally oppose the October 7 terror attack on Israel, while observing that too many civilians had now been killed in Gaza. The Prime Minister said there was a responsibility to de-escalate tensions given a noticeable increase in anti-Semitism within Australia, and accused Peter Dutton of taking an opportunistic approach to the Middle East conflict.
Now, I mentioned this one at the top of the show, Sean. Health Minister Mark Butler says the Albanese government will introduce some of the world's toughest laws to Parliament in an effort to crack down on the proliferation of illicit vaping products.
Yes, so the reforms will ban recreational vaping totally by enforcing a licensing regime on the import and sale of vaping products, regulations to stop retailers concealing nicotine in their products, and tougher advertising rules. Under the current laws, nicotine vaping products are legal as prescription-only medicines. However, the Albanese government says this has led to importers and retailers concealing the presence of nicotine in vapes. A recent campaign led by the Australian Border Force and Therapeutic Goods Administration found that more than 92% of imported vaping products unlawfully contained nicotine. Mr. Butler yesterday told the ABC the answer is just to ban recreational vaping, full stop.
Do you remember the first time you saw somebody vaping, Sean? And it's just, for me, it was just this moment of shock because there is just such a cloud that just appears. I remember someone in their car and I just looking to see this massive cloud of vapor or whatever it is just comes spewing out of the car to the extent that I thought the car was actually on fire. It's quite a shock when you see it the first time.
You see, my experience was more, Sean, do you remember the first time you found a vape in your house and you had to persecute every child, every 8 of them, to say, who brought that vape into the house?
Did you get to the bottom of it, or did they kind of...
No, well, I think there were a number of contenders for that one. I have my suspicions, though. You know who you are.
Do you reckon they'll be listening?
No, not a chance.
Okay, all right. Well, in that case, your threat just then is probably a little bit hollow.
Well, it's just dad at work, isn't it, really?
Yeah, of
it's
course
interesting what dad does at work.
All right, now, Telstra has received a bump in customers as a result of the Optus outage last week. This is probably always going to happen, but that's pretty quick.
Yeah, so Chief Executive Vicky Brady told investors that the network disruption probably won't cause a significant shift in market share, but there has been a pickup akin to when Optus last year said it had been hacked. Back then, there were higher acquisition figures for Telstra for about 6 weeks. Then things went back to normal. Brady was talking at the Telco's Investor Day yesterday. She said planning was underway for an additional 5 routes in its intercity fibre project, as well as upgrades to connections for mining, oil and gas companies in the Pilbara. Now, that intercity project will ultimately connect physically via fibre optic cable all of Australia's mainland cities. Quite a project. Telstra's share price closed down 2% yesterday.
It's an interesting one, isn't it, when, say, this happens with Optus and Telstra, and as you mentioned last year with the hack as well, that Telstra wouldn't want to be seen to be kicking Optus while they're down, because it's the kind of situation that really any company could end up in a situation like this. But behind kind of closed doors, they would be watching very closely just to see what the effect is and just how many new customers they might be able to attract.
Let's just amp up our advertising for the next few weeks. Secure network, things like that.
Now, Sean, it's 6 weeks till Christmas, which is kind of frightening. So therefore, it is time that we start talking about disruptions to air travel, isn't it? Speaking of coincidence, the Transport Workers Union has increased pressure on Virgin Australia over pay agreements as the airline resumes plans to relist, with another group of workers raising the prospect, here we go, of strikes before Christmas.
You heard it here first. Probably could have heard it here first last year and the year before, and we'll hear it here first next year as well. Virgin cabin crew have applied to the Fair Work Commission for a protected action ballot after ground crew did the same thing 3 weeks ago, as talks over a new enterprise agreement stalled, according to the Financial Review. The TWU said Virgin cancelled a meeting with the cabin crew due last week, labelling the airline's approach to bargaining frustrating. Now, this latest breakdown in pay talks comes as Virgin looks to resume its initial public offering efforts. They're targeting a May listing. Investors have already flagged cost pressures as a major concern for investing in any IPO. Things like jet fuel prices, but also wage and fleet replacement bills have all been raised as issues.
The number of visitors to and from Australia is creeping higher, though arrival and departures remain well below pre-COVID levels.
Yeah, it's taking a long time to get back to normal, whatever that is, I suppose. We're back to about where we were in 2014, 15 or so. There were 584,000 short-term arrivals in September. That's about 50% higher than a year ago when things were sort of resuming. Short-term resident returns, people coming home to visit the family, for example, were also up by about 50%. Total arrivals in September was just over 1.6 million, according to the ABS, while the total departures was just under 1.6 million. New Zealand is the largest source country, about 22% of visitor arrivals. Next is China and then the USA.
All right, turning to international news now, and US President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping are set to announce an agreement that would see Beijing crack down on the manufacture and export of fentanyl, potentially delivering the US president what would be a major victory.
Yeah, this is a big one. Under the deal, which is still being finalised, China would go after chemical companies to stem the flow of both fentanyl and the source material used to make the deadly synthetic opioid, according to a report on Bloomberg. In return, the Biden administration will lift restrictions on China's Forensic Police Institute, an entity the US has alleged is responsible for human rights abuses. The agreement is set to be announced tonight when Biden and Xi meet in San Francisco. That, of course, is on the sidelines of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation Summit. Will be the first time the two have met in more than a year. Now, the discussions are also likely to include strengthening communications between the two superpowers and managing competition.
How about this one, Sean? Google pays Apple 36% of the revenue it earns from search advertising made through the Safari browser.
Very important number, that 36%. So it was disclosed during testimony in Google's defense at the Justice Department's antitrust trial in Washington. Neither Google nor Apple wanted to disclose any details of the agreement between the two. They've had it since 2002. Google basically said it would undermine its competitive standing. Under the deal, the default search engine in Apple Safari is Google. That deal is the most important of Google's default deals since it sets the search engine for the iPhone, which is the most used smartphone in the US. Now, the Justice Department is targeting that particular agreement as evidence Google is illegally maintaining its dominance over the search engine and search advertising markets, but it is paying 36% of revenue from Safari to Apple.
All right, one last one, Sean. How about this? I quite like this story.
This one's for you. For you.
I appreciate that. Electric air taxis could be transporting passengers from JFK Airport to downtown Manhattan by 2025. Now, that's just 2 years away. That's less than 2 years away. That's 18 months away. On quiet, emissions-free journeys that take around 7 minutes.
Yes, so I don't know whether you ever caught a taxi from JFK to Manhattan, but that can be more than an hour.
Yes, it is a very, very, very steady trip.
Steady. Manufacturer Joby Aviation carried out an exhibition flight at the downtown Manhattan heliport in New York on the weekend. It was actually the city's first ever electric air taxi flight. The craft can recharge in about 5 minutes while passengers are unloading and boarding, according to a report on Reuters. The idea is that travellers will book their trip similar to a rideshare app. The company aims to begin commercial passenger services in 2025. It's actually in the third of 5 stages of certification with the Federal Aviation Administration. The cost of booking a trip has yet to be confirmed, but the company has previously said it will likely be comparable to a rideshare in a car. Wouldn't that be amazing?
I'm just looking at pictures of this now, Sean.
It's pretty cool.
That is really cool. When you said air taxi, I just didn't know what to. I had a picture of kind of like the Jetsons, kind of, which is a normal kind of car, but that just makes that noise as it flies. And instead, it is like it's like a helicopter.
A mega drone, somewhere between a mega drone and a helicopter.
Yeah, with like 6 or 7 kind of rotors around it.
Yeah.
Wow, hey, look at that thing. That's amazing.
Yeah, it's pretty cool, isn't it?
In 2025, that does feel kind of optimistic though, doesn't it?
Well, they're sort of, they did their first flight over the weekend. They're, stage 3 of 5 stages of certification.
Okay. All right.
I reckon there's enough rich people in New York. Well, even the cost, they reckon it'll be comparable to a rideshare in a car.
That is amazing. Oh, you know what? I'm just going to put a little reservation on this story. I'm bagsing this as my favourite story of the week.
I love the fact that you're bagsing it.
Yeah. I think that's a universally accepted term, just like shotgun when you're approaching a car and want to sit in the front seat. No?
Moving on. Surely, can we talk about my interview that we've got next?
Yes, Darren Hopkins and Blair Sutton from McGrath-Nicol Advisory.
All about ransomware attacks. Really fascinating, especially the numbers they've got on the number of people that are attacked and how much they pay out. Incredible. Yeah,
it is a very good one. And of course, McGrath-Nicol Advisory is a fantastic supporter of this podcast. You will find that interview coming up next in the Fear and Greed playlist on your podcast platform or at fearandgreed.com.au. Thank you, Sean.
Before we go, Michael, I think you've forgotten something, so thank you, but it's Wednesday.
Oh,
how did they afford that day?
It is. How do they afford that day? How did I nearly forgot that, Sean? I don't think I've ever been the one to forget it and you to remind me.
What's the show on?
It is all about Black Friday because it's coming up. It is just around the corner. It's only, a week and a half away now. And it is basically a guide to how to make the most of the Black Friday sales, kind of where to get the best deals, kind of how to manage it, what to do online, what to do in person, how to get kind of double discounts on things, a few little tips and tricks and hacks. It's actually really kind of good, especially in the lead up to Christmas.
I will be listening.
Excellent. I'll put a link in today's show notes so it's easy for you to find. Thank you once again, Sean.
Thank you very much, Michael.
It is Wednesday, the 15th of November, 2023. Make sure you're following the podcast and please join us online on LinkedIn, Instagram, X and Facebook. I'm Michael Thompson and that was Fear and Greed Business News. Have a great day.